you can't access the live chat and you really want to ask us a question, email it through and it'll be popped through. I've got my iPad here, so I'll be keeping an eye on the questions coming in. So yeah, I think without further ado, I'll introduce our first guest, a very familiar face, Paul Nixon, our in-house military expert, who I'm sure you've seen do webinars and Friday Live videos before. So yeah, over to you, Paul.
Great, thank you very much, Alex. Welcome everybody, thanks for tuning in. I'm going to talk about wounded soldiers in the First World War. I mean, I've been studying the First World War for many, many years now, and I became interested when my grandfather was, when he died actually. I mean, he was in the Garrison Artillery. He died in 1980 when I was a teenager, and I really regretted not having spoken to him more about his service. So after he died, I set about trying to find men who'd served in the First World War who I could speak to. I sort of reliving my grandfather's war experience through what they were telling me. So can you move on to the next slide for me, please, Max? So this first man here, Thurlby Hack, I met him when I was at university, and he's the man sitting in the bath chair looking towards the camera with the corporal stripes. He was in his 90s when I met him, but very, very fit. He was a gardener by trade, gardener most of his life. He was wounded in 1915 at Fresenberg near Ypres. He was served with the Leicestershire Yeomanry, and the Leicestershire Yeomanry was very badly cut up, and he remembered that day, 30th of May 1915, throughout the rest of his life. So what I'm going to be talking about is looking at records for men like Thurlby Hack and some of the other men I met, and I just regret really that the records that you can find now on Findmypast were not there then.
Yeah, of course.
So I'm still learning things about them then, things they told me, little snippets, and now I'm finding them still on Findmypast.
And I guess that is actually an important overall point as well, in the sense that the rate at which new material is being added online. If you tried military research 2-3 years ago and didn't have any joy, it's a completely different playing field now.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I was doing this in the early 1980s, and then you had to go to Kew and you had to request a fiche to look at a medal index card and return it to the desk. Oh gosh, it was a palaver. But anyway, let's move on to the next slide, please, Max. Can we? So here are three of the men I met, and it's really good to see these men and to be able to talk about them actually, because I was very fond of them when they were alive. So the first man on the left is Mr. Lang, Reginald Lang. I mean, I only met him once, maybe twice. He was badly wounded with the King's Royal Rifle Corps. He was sniped, shot in the head.
Wow.
He was, you can't really see on that photo there, but he's got a scar on his face. He can only ever open his mouth.
I think you can. Yeah, you
on the
can
left-hand
just
side.
above his eye.
Well, it's towards the left. It's like a big dimple, really. But he was, he was shot. The helmet, his tin helmet, went into his head as well. So he got the jagged pieces of the helmet in his head.
Wow.
And he could only ever open his mouth a very, very small way after he was wounded. But he
was that from the brain injury?
just from his jaw being shattered. Actually.
Oh wow!
So, but he did recover, and he went on to serve with the Royal Flying Corps or the RAF. And I found records for him in Findmypast in the RAF records. And also discovered actually later what his regimental number was, because at the time I was young. I was saying, what regiment did you serve with? And he said, King's Royal Rifle Corps. And I left it at that. I didn't find out the battalion or the number, that sort of information, or he didn't know the number. So all this information I've picked up later on as I've gone through. So thanks to Findmypast, I found that. The next man, back Max, please. The next man, Alan Castle, he lost his leg at Beaumont Hamel on the Somme. Again, Findmypast has Royal Naval Division records for all the R&D men, so I can see his record there. He's announced as ill and dangerously ill and all the rest of it, and he finally recovered. I've told this story before on Findmypast, but he finally recovered. In peacetime, he worked at a tailor's shop in London. He was fitted with his artificial leg and went back to work, and then was dismissed shortly afterwards. And the reason that they gave him was that he couldn't walk to the door quickly enough to escort the customs out of the shop.
Oh gosh, that's rather heartless, isn't it?
Rather, yeah. So, but anyway, the good thing is I met him again in probably 1981, 82. At that time, there's a little community of men. There was him. There was another man called Reg Crane, who I used to go to the pub with to have a drink. There was Harry Leakes. There was Bill Minchin. There was a lot of them. You know, they were in their 80s then. I was 18. They were 80 plus. Mr. Castle, he was, and I always knew them as Mr. Castle, not Reg or whatever.
No,
anyway,
is that how you found them, through the kind of community that had stayed in
touch? Partly that, and partly this 18-year-old on a bike going to old people's homes, knocking on the door, saying, "Come the old man, I can speak." And that was really it. But I met 100 men by the end of the day. So there was him. So his records were on Findmypast. And the next man, Arthur Slater, he again lost his leg. He was an officer with the Devonshire Machine Gun Corps, lost his leg, and I met him. Again, Find My Past, you go there and you will find a link to his service record at the National Archives. It's not been digitised, but you can access it.
Okay.
So that's just a way of me remembering these three men. If you can go to the next slide, please, for me, Max. Stan Brown, he was the chairman of the Old Contemptibles Association in Chelmsford. The Old Contemptibles were the men who first went out to France to fight against the Germans in 1914. And Stan was quite young. He was born in 1897. So he was only 17 when he was out there. He joined the East Surreys originally.
Would he have lied about his age?
He probably did, yeah, he did. But he transferred, I think he was with the Leicesters and then later the South Staffordshire. But I always remember that he said to me, and I've got his, and most of these men for that matter on tape, talking to me, saying at Passchendaele, mate, I got the blooming lot.
Wow,
and he meaning that he was gassed. You can see there, I've just put the summary. He got a gunshot wound to his right hand, first of all, then a gunshot wound to his left thigh, and then finally a gunshot wound to his left hand. And again, for him, you know, his records are on Find My Past in W364.
That's one a year, isn't it?
Yeah. Well, he lost his finger. It says there on that extract I've given there. I can't really make it out. Yeah, second finger, right hand, amputated as a result of the gunshot wound. And he also lost a lung as well. He was gassed. So when he was talking to me about Passchendaele, I got the blooming lot.
Yeah.
He was shot and he was gassed.
My great grandfather lost a lung as well, actually, from gas. Yeah.
So Stan, I was fond of him, and I enrolled him in the Western Front Association, and he was, you know, he had a good later life actually. He sort of had a renewed lease of life and interest in the First World War, and he actually was a veteran of the Christmas truce as well.
Oh, wow!
So he was out there when the Germans, when they went out into no man's land, and they were, playing football with the Germans. And he said to me, one of the Germans held up a bottle of wine, and one of our men shot at it.
Really?
Yeah. So, but yeah, it was great. It was great speaking to them, and I feel privileged to have known them and to have been old enough to, or young enough actually, to have spoken to them when they were still alive. So today, anyone listening to this, if you've got your don't forget our Second World War veterans. You know, they are now of a similar age to the First World War men when I was interviewing them. So it's important to speak to these people and to get their recollections and to listen to what they have to say. Next slide, please, Max. Thank you. James Simpson, again, another man I met, and I highlight his record because I want to talk about Silver War Badge records, which we have on Find My Past. So, again, he lived a stone's throw from where I lived in Chelmsford. I still live in Chelmsford. He was talked here. I was on one of 3 machine gun posts when a shell dropped. He got bad injuries. One of the doctors wanted to amputate his legs, but he said, no, you can experiment, and they did experiment, and he actually was fine. And he was, he was, I wouldn't say hale and hearty, but he was walking around with the use of a stick in later life. So what you can see at the bottom there, that illustration, is the Silver War Badge, and we have the Silver War Badge roll. So that was for men who'd been injured or who were sick, discharged sick or discharged injured, and they wore this badge on their lapel. So it showed to anybody who was interested or who cared that they'd done their bit for king and country, so you wouldn't come up and give them a white feather.
Of course, yeah.
So the Silver War Badge. So you'll see this on medal index cards often. So there's a good tip. I mean, of course, you think that everybody knows all this, but not everybody does. Look at the medal index card, and you see the abbreviation SWB list often. It says SWB list. That's Silver War Badge list, which is a reference to another roll, which is a Silver War Badge roll, which is a very useful roll. And if you click to the next image, please, Max.
Because it's also quite shocking that men, wounded veterans were given white feathers with such frequency that they had to do this.
I think particularly in the early years, probably later on, then people may have appreciated a bit more that just the toll it was taking on the male population. But there you can see a man. It's not nobody I knew. It's a postcard I once owned, wearing his Silver War Badge. But here the details are for Mr. Simpson, who I met, who we just saw the photo of. So it gives his regimental number, his rank, the badge number, but more importantly the enlistment date and the discharge date, regiment, why he was discharged. It's a very useful roll. It gives a lot of information.
And just a quick question. It says cause of discharge, and you've got that number code next to it saying wounds, like 392 XVI.
Yes.
Is there somewhere where you could easily find out what those codes mean?
Well, you can. That refers to paragraph 392, 16. subsection A,
it's a reference
of King's Regulations. Yeah, it's King's Regulations for 1912, updated to August 1914. You can find those online. There is a very useful site which I have bookmarked, which gives you all the different paragraphs and the updates through the years. But yes, it's a reference to that. So wherever you see that, it doesn't say KR there, but you'll often find it says KR, which is King's Regulations.
Okay.
So that's what it's for. But basically, that paragraph means no longer physically fit for war service. That's what that means. So Silver War Badge roll, very useful. And if you can flick to the next one, please, Max.
Oh wow!
Yeah, now this is gosh, what a traumatic collection this is. So I mean, when I joined Find My Past back in 2010, it wasn't that long after I joined that I became aware of Andrew Bamji, who'd got the Gillies collection. I think I'd seen something on TV about it. But anyway, what Andrew Bamji was doing at the time was curating the archive at Sidcup, at the Queen Mary's Hospital Sidcup, which was for facially injured soldiers, and he had all the records that had been kept by Harold Gillies, who was the plastic surgeon, and his team, and those records included notes and also photos as well of the men, so the men before treatment and the men after treatment. And I mean, these two photos I've put here are quite sanitised.
Yeah, some of them are quite difficult to look at, aren't they?
Some are horrendous. In fact, we've Find My Past digitised the archive. And if you buy that book, actually, you'll see in there, and I didn't realise at the time, but you open the page and there's a acknowledgement to Find My Past.
Oh wow!
And to me.
Oh really?
Yeah. So
in the credits.
So fame at last. But yes, it's through my insistence really that we digitised the archive. But ultimately we decided that the photos were too graphic to publish, so we never published the photos. We have them, but we never published them. But you'll find quite a few of them in this book here, and they are. If anybody wants a reason not to go to war, then read that book.
Yeah, I can imagine.
But again, we've got the Gillies collection on Find My Past, but it's just index entries. It's not images. But you could, again, if you go to Find My Past, if you go to do a search of military records, you might find Reginald Lang, the first man we looked at who'd been shot in the jaw.
Yes.
He wasn't a patient of Gillies, but you could, for instance, find him in a service record, you could find him in a Gillies collection, you could find him in a Silver War Badge. The more records that we add, the more chance you have of finding people and finding them in multiple collections as well.
And I guess even if you don't find an image of your ancestor in this collection, knowing that they were treated there is, because it was really pioneering stuff, wasn't it? It was.
Oh gosh, absolutely. I mean, I don't know how much that photo on the right has been doctored, but when you look at the images, I just am staggered at how good they are, how good the surgery was so many years ago.
Yeah.
I mean, what you don't know, of course, is that the man who was injured in the mouth never ate in front of his guests and ordered to eat alone in the kitchen. Things like that. Because of the slurping noises. It's tragic stuff. But Harold Gillies was a pioneer of plastic surgery, and I heartily recommend the book, which has just been recently published. And it's well illustrated, and as I say, it's a good lesson in why not to go to war. So moving on, please. Soldiers' medical records in MH106. This is exclusive. Here we go, an exclusive for Find My Past. Exclusively not available this weekend, but it will be available next weekend. So these records are it's a selection of records from admissions and discharges from hospitals. It's not a complete collection of records, but it's complete in the sense that what we're digitising is all that there is. But there would have been far more admission and discharge registers which were not kept. This is just a representative sample. But what you do get here is details of men being admitted. You get the regimental number, the name, the reason for admission, where they were then sent on to. So this is an example from 14th Field Ambulance, I believe, and you can see why people were admitted. So interesting that I think entry on this page, you won't see it here because the detail is not close enough, but East Surrey Regiment, a man admitted for sunstroke. Early days of the war, the troops were out there, they were marching, many of the men were unfit, they'd been recalled from the reserve, and it wasn't just shot and shell which put men in hospital. It was things like sunstroke or exhaustion, which
you wouldn't associate sunstroke with the First World War.
No, you would not in those early days. But it's so what we're releasing next week. which you'll need to pay for. Sorry, you'll watch it to look at it. It's records. There's 200,000 records that we're launching with, and there'll be more to follow. But what you do get is records from not only the British, but from Commonwealth troops, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, but also Indian soldiers, lots of regiments, and Germans, German prisoners, Italian prisoners from the Italian front, French as well. There's a whole lot. So has been an extremely tricky collection to index properly, which is why we're taking our time doing it. But 200,000 is the first release. So do tune in next week and look at those records. They're fantastic. Next slide, please, Max. I'm rounding up here now, so I'm going to just talk about records you can find in newspapers and periodicals. This isn't necessarily Wounded, but it's just an example of the extent of the records you can find and the detail. So this is from the Illustrated War News. It shows you men, officers of the 16th Lancers, and they're all named. It's fantastic, as a resource. And those records you'll find on Find My Past and on the British Newspaper Archive. So you need to go to the newspaper section of Find My Past to look at those. And then finally, Max, if we can just move to my last slide, please. So Wounded, list of Wounded. So again, on the newspapers on Find My Past, if you go to the Irish Times or if you go to the Scotsman, you'll find these lists of men published every single day. At the start, later on it was weekly casualty lists, but at the start it was daily. Listing the casualty, type of casualty, so you'll find killed, you'll find died of wounds, or missing, and wounded. And as we were saying earlier on, it's a good tip. If you look at, let's say here we're looking at Dragoon Guards. I mean, there were different regiments of Dragoon Guards, but let's say it's the 1st Dragoon Guards. You find those 3 men there who are all wounded. Go and look at the men for the 1st Dragoon Guards who were killed. You might find that there's half a dozen of them all killed on the same date. And it might then be a good bet that those men were killed on the same, were wounded on the same day. So you then cross-reference that date with the war diaries.
Oh wow!
And find out potentially how those men were wounded. So loads of resources. As I say, I just wish that I'd been able, when I was talking to these men years and years ago, to say, look, I found you.
Oh yeah, that would have been incredible, wouldn't it?
Yeah. So, but anyway, it is what it is, and there's more records coming all the time. Also next week, Pin 82. We're also releasing Pin 82, which is Widows' Pension Forms. So again, another great collection to look out for.
Yeah, because I guess rather than so much of military research is focused on the soldiers themselves, but those records will allow you to look at the people they left behind.
Look at the widows, and look at the children as well. Yeah. So anyway, it's been great. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Paul. We'll have you back on the end for our panel discussion. So thanks, Paul. Cheers. So yeah, no, that was really fascinating. I hope you enjoyed that as much as I did. I honestly think that discovering your ancestors' stories and learning more about the sacrifices they made in military records, it is a fantastic way of commemorating their sacrifices and honouring Remembrance Day, really. So yeah, but now without further ado, I'm joined by my next guest, a very special guest who's come all the way over from the National Archives at Kew, Audrey Collins. Audrey is probably a familiar face because you've done webinars for us before,
yes, yeah.
Regular viewer of our Friday live videos, and you're always helping us in the comments, which we're eternally grateful for. But yeah, so Audrey is a record expert at the National Archives, and what she doesn't know about the 1939 register genuinely isn't worth knowing. So I believe you're going to be telling us how you can use the 39 register to uncover details of military service, which is not something I would have even thought to look for.
No, it's not. Thank you for that, Alex. Yes, I'm really looking at wartime records, so not necessarily military, although a surprising number. Now, this household schedule that you're looking at, this is what was distributed to all the households in specifically England and Wales, which is the records we've got on Find My Past. And if you're familiar with the household schedule from the 1911 census, you'll see this is a lot less detailed.
Yeah.
And the 39 register was taken for a very specific purpose, which was to get identity cards and ration books, and they also used the list to get conscription going. I mean, they didn't make such a big deal about the publicity for that, but everybody knew that's what it was.
I guess because, of course, you don't want to send all your coal miners off, do you? Because then who's going to mine coal? And
exactly. So it was direction of labour and military, military conscription later on in the war. Now, there's a couple of things to remember here. First of all, it doesn't ask for a lot of information, but it does ask for quite a lot of information about people's occupations, and very specifically, and you can see it from a detail here on the there's a detail. If you have the next slide, please, Max, that just shows the the detail about military.
One back, please.
This was on the front of the form, and this was giving people very specific instructions about how to record anybody who was in the armed services.
Oh,
now I'm sure many of you know if you've used the register, it's mainly about the civilian population, but it does include some military personnel, which is people who were already in the armed forces,
which was
if they were at home on leave, or if they were at least away from base, not necessarily at home, but away from base and not in a billet. So if they were at home, if they were in a hotel, if they were away visiting, you will find some serving soldiers and sailors and airmen on there.
What is that? Is that because they'd still need rations?
Exactly, yeah. So albeit for a short time, but they would need rations for the duration while they were off base. Otherwise, the military authorities were looking after them and all their identity. But if you look at this in detail, it also asks about people who were in various reserve forces and who were in non-military services. It mentions their ARP, air raid precautions, ambulance services, and there were all sorts of other things. So that information was gathered, and you will see that in the 39
So
register.
Home Guard, would you see that in there?
Yeah, the Home Guard, which originally was the local defence volunteers, but anything like that, you get things like the WVS, which it's now the Royal Women's Voluntary Service. It was the WVS then, and the Red Cross, and all sorts of other non-military but war-related efforts and occupations that people had. So the next one just shows you, well, you've already seen it, the back of the form, which has got the same information again, Max, if you
Next
go to
slide,
that. That's it. And that just repeats more of the same. But again, this is more instructions to householders, and it's really all about occupations, and specifically military and naval, including the merchant navy. I mean, the merchant navy was one of the really dangerous things to be in, because essentially you were in harm's way, but you generally couldn't shoot back.
Of course.
So the role of the merchant navy was very, very important.
So this will be why there was about 9 million unique occupations then, will it?
Well, it could well be. There are a lot of very different occupations, and some of them almost defy description. But what I want to talk about here, if you could move on to the next one, please, Max, is really there are 3 ways that you can use the 39 register to find out about people's war service, and I use the term generally. First of all, you might well see some indication of what people had done during the First World War, or sometimes even earlier, because they sometimes did put that on the form. For example, you will get quite a number of people, if you do an occupation search for ex-soldier or disabled ex-soldier or terms like that, you will find an awful lot. And those are mainly going to be First World War veterans.
I must admit, one of the things we noticed when we put it up, that when we were looking at the most common occupations, was that for men, invalid ranked incredibly highly. Yes. And do you think that would be an after effect?
Oh, yes. I mean, you have to look at them to be sure in every single case. But in general, if you put disabled ex-soldier, invalid, even words that we wouldn't use now, but crippled is another one. So you do find an awful lot of people who are still literally bearing the scars of previous conflicts.
Oh, wow.
And some of them were even older, and they might have served in the Boer War or just been regular soldiers at some point before or after the First World War. You will also find information about Second World War service. Now, some of this is going to be actual servicemen at home on leave with their units and their service numbers, which is great. Or it might be their non-military occupations, so I put their home front, and this would be people like the ambulance, the Red Cross, special constables, observer corps, all kinds of things, and you will probably find some that I haven't come across yet.
Would it not cover people working in war, essential war industries like manufacturing or munitions?
That would be done because they were civilians. That would be listed as their civilian occupation in their occupation column, and it's well worth looking at that. And I'm going to go on now and show some examples of the sort of things that you might find from some pages from the register itself. There's nothing particularly special about this page. It's from Northern, which is just on the outskirts of Manchester, but it's a fairly ordinary page, and you'll see that you've got the column, which is personal occupation, and that's where you find their civilian occupation, and these are fairly ordinary things. With if it says heavy worker in brackets, then that was something that was specifically asked for because heavy workers needed extra rations.
Of course, yeah.
But the interesting thing is the right-hand column, which is headed C Instructions. And that right-hand column is where you will find information that was added afterwards. Sometimes it was added very soon afterwards because I can see it's in the same handwriting as the enumerator.
Yeah.
But sometimes it's very obviously different, and it could have been added quite some time after September 39.
How late? Would they, I mean, I'm imagining it would have been the war years.
It would have been the war years. It's one of the many things that we don't really know, but we're trying to work out. And in that column, you will get things like the ARP. I mean, there's two on here.
I can see what their ARP service.
And the one below it, which I'm sure you can't read, but I know what it says because I've seen it before, and that's his ambulance service. And you will sometimes get bits of extra detail. Now, the information that's in this right-hand column, whatever it is, can be rather frustrating. And this is because that right-hand column is actually the left-hand column of the right-hand page, and we do not get to see most of the right-hand page.
Is that because that's all the sensitive medical information?
Yes, it can be. Yeah. So that's why that information is permanently closed, and we can't see it. Findmypast can't see it, and the National Archives can't see it because it's a digital-only accession.
I guess we should probably quickly explain to any complete beginners watching that the 39 register was the building blocks of our beloved NHS, wasn't it?
Yes,
so
exactly.
That's why that medical information is there.
And that's why the register survives. If it wasn't for the NHS, there would have been no need to keep this.
Another thing to thank them for.
Exactly, after the end of registration in 1951. Unfortunately, the people filling this in, and it was hand annotated for many years afterwards, they didn't know that right-hand bit was going to be permanently redacted. So sometimes if what they wrote strayed into the right-hand column, you'll miss a word or the end of a word. So sometimes we just have to guess. And it's frustrating, but there's nothing we can do about it. The next illustration is possibly a slightly more interesting one. And this is one of several that I've taken from where I grew up, not where I'm from, but where I grew up. And again, on the right-hand side, you can see a couple of ARP wardens. And I've only got this slide because the first ARP warden was in the house that my brother now lives in.
Oh, wow.
And he was also, if you look at his occupation, he was a schoolmaster in HM Dockyard.
Oh, wow.
And on the next slide, you'll see something from very nearby, a garrison town. Well, the first place was in Gillingham.
Yeah.
And Gillingham and Chatham and Rochester, the Medway, collectively the Medway towns, that is very much a garrison town. And I've chosen some examples from here because it's a good place to look for lots of the interesting things you might find. So you will get things like people's military service, and of course in Medway towns you get lots and lots of old soldiers and old sailors. In fact, the Medway towns has got, or did have the lot, as well as Chatham Dockyard, it got Royal Marine Barracks, Navy, also obviously lots of Navy personnel, Royal School of Military Engineering was there, Royal Engineers, all of the Army and the Navy and the Marines, and nearby in Rochester, Short Brothers were building aircraft.
Oh, so there's a lot of activity there.
So on one of these, and I forget which one it is, but one of the people whose occupations I saw here was an aircraft fitter.
Oh, wow.
So if you look at the returns for somewhere like this, you will find lots of nice examples. And of course, if you happen to have family who were in Chatham or Gillingham or Portsmouth or Aldershot or Catterick or any of those places that have got a strong military or naval presence, you will find lots of people whose civilian occupations were very much concerned with the war. You will get people here who worked in the dockyard. I said that there was an aircraft fitter, and so on. There's lots more. The next one is actually from Chatham itself, which is only just down the road. By the way, piece of trivia: Chatham Dockyard actually in Gillingham, but never mind that. This one, there's a lot more detail, and the handwriting in the right-hand column is different from the enumerator's handwriting, but there is more detail about the services that people were in. You can see ARP and various other things there, and sometimes they just give you little bits of extra detail about which particular base they were connected to. Oh. And you will also sometimes see people's subsequent service in the Second World War.
Yeah.
Now, conscription didn't start in earnest until early 1940, but earlier than that, a very, very few young men had already been called up. They started compulsory military service in partway through 1939. So a few very young men The very first few months' worth of those had already been called up. But if you had a member of your family who was in the Second World War and who was conscripted, they were probably still civilians in 1939. So it's worth looking for them, even if you know that they were in the Army or the Navy.
So yeah, the overwhelming majority of servicemen you probably will be able to find in it.
The ones that you won't expect to find are the ones who were regular soldiers, and who were already in the services, obviously, or the ones who had been in the reserves and who had been called up instantly at the beginning of the war, which started at the beginning of September, and this is late September. But there are lots of things. If you look at this in detail, at your leisure, look at people's occupations, either their civilian occupations or some of the details about the military. Because this is full of old soldiers, sometimes you'll see that they've given a little bit of detail about their previous service. They might give you a hint.
Can I see a Royal Navy pensioner?
Yes, you almost certainly can. I think there's quite a few there. And that might possibly be the first hint that somebody had been in the service. It may be maybe not a close member of the family, but somebody think, well, that's interesting. It could be Uncle Albert, and then that might give you a cue to look up and see if you can find an Army record, Navy record, Royal Marines, or whatever. And then going on from that, the next one. Keeping up with the military thing, this is the Naval and Military Club in Piccadilly.
Oh wow!
This is a posh person's place, and this is.
And would people have been living? The people were living at this address, or?
Well, I don't know how long they were there, but this is certainly absolutely stuffed full of Army, military and Navy officers. And if you look at the column, which isn't normally filled in, but for institutions, you've got people who are officers or inmates. Now, this isn't an institution, as in a prisoner or an asylum, but some of these people you can see, I is a resident or somebody who's staying there, and O will be someone who worked there.
Oh, in the OVSPI column, is this?
Yes, and that's not very often filled in. And there you can see, if you look at this in detail, some of these Army officers give wonderfully detailed descriptions. One of them, it says that he was wounded. That he was actually invalided out due to wounds from February 1916, I think it was. So they do give a lot of detail, and there are even a couple of very senior American, I think a couple of brigadier generals.
Oh, really?
Because they've got to be somewhere. So there's a lot of Americans in 1939 register. So that's a whole other thing. But again, some of these people, they were called back into service, not necessarily in the military, but perhaps as advisors or civilian workers with the War Office or the Admiralty. So again, you can see there's a lot in that right-hand column. And carrying on with the military thing, the next one is quite different. It's also, instead of being beige and brown, it's grey and black.
But you can see straight away, can't you? It looks very different.
That's one of the books where being constantly used. Some of the books were getting battered, so the National Health Service had them photocopied, which is why they look odd. This one is actually still very legible, but I put Soldiers Old and New because rather neatly, the one at the very top says ex-soldier, clerk in the War Office, which I think we can reasonably say is the War Office, but it's just an example of things not quite fitting in. And then right at the very bottom, this is an active soldier, an army musician, the band of the Grenadier Guards. And there he is, gives all his details and his service number. So if you happen to be related to this particular man or one of the others, it gives you the service number, which does make it easier for getting a record from the MOD. So that's, by contrast with all the senior army officers, you will still find information about the ordinary soldiers in the other ranks. Now the next one is something that you will find distressingly rather a lot of. There is, you can see the only one who's got anything in the right hand column there is ex-soldier, and although you can't see it all here, this particular one, like an awful lot of the ones which are ex-soldiers or disabled ex-soldiers, they're in hospitals of some kind, and very often they're in mental hospitals, which is a very strong hint about what they must have suffered in the First World War, which you don't always get a hint of, even if they have a service record. That doesn't always give all the clues that you need to see what was to come.
And to think of the amount of time that the psychological trauma. I mean, that's decades later, isn't it?
This is a generation on, whether they've been there all the time or whether they've been in civilian life. who knows? Although if you were researching an individual, you might find that out. An odd little thing here that you might have noticed is that in a lot of institutions, public assistance institutions, and particularly mental hospitals, you've only got a year of birth because they didn't necessarily have the person's date of birth.
Of course, and then you wouldn't be able to ask them.
Exactly,
in many cases.
which I've noticed that in a few of these institutions. So that's it's a sad and rather depressing note, but I think it needs to be mentioned.
No, definitely.
It wasn't just that the physical wounds, that there were mental wounds. Having said that, there are an awful lot of disabled ex-soldiers and ex-soldiers who seem to be living with their families, so it wasn't all gloom, but I think we should remember these people too. If we carry on just to the next one, this is another, it's a hotel, the Regent Palace Hotel in London, which was very much favoured by Army and Navy people. And there's a couple of interesting things on here. Again, you can see there's a lot of detail that they've recorded. And one of the men here was, there's one on this and one on the next page, which is the bottom of the same page. They are people that were ex-soldiers, but they were in the colonial service. So there was someone who, and I can't quite read it here, but on one of those two pages, someone who had been farming in southern Rhodesia and returned to the UK on, and he gives the exact date, which is the 29th of September 1930 something, because it's lost on the right hand side, reported to the War Office what looks like the very next day. So you get people who are very explicitly saying, I have been in the colonies. There was someone there from the Kenya, as it would have been pronounced then. So there are all kinds of information there. Now, it might not be about your family, but you can see what was going on, what their neighbours were up to, what was going on in their street, in their town. So it's all useful background, even if there is nothing apparently interesting in your family. So the final one, I think, is... this is another record set altogether, which is on Findmypast.
We like that, that's good. Royal
Artillery attestations. Now, a big health warning with these, you won't find what I'm about to tell you on all of them. Okay. But I noticed on some of these Royal Artillery records, you can see just under each man's forename, you've got 4 letters and a couple of numbers. And I didn't notice this at first, but when you look at them, I thought, that looks like a national identity number. And you can find these men, and I know you can because I have found them all, in the 39 register using the browse function. You can put in the letter code and find the enumeration book and then just work through it until you find them. And you might not find your person there, and statistically you're very unlikely to, but some of these men have got quite common names. So if your man was in the Royal Artillery and he was called something like Robert Bassett or William Fisher,
Thomas Duffy,
or Albert Collins, nothing to do with me. He's you could look him up in the register and find out whether he was the man that you wanted or not.
Of course, yeah.
So even a little bit of information can be very useful.
I genuinely didn't know that was even something you could do.
I thought I'd find a good one to finish.
No, that's very good. Great way to finish. Thanks very much. Okay. That was a surprising fact of the day. So thank you very much, Audrey. Audrey will be joining us again at the end when we're doing our panel. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Audrey. 1939 register, one of my favourite record sets on the site, and I genuinely had no idea you could uncover details of military service in that way. But without further ado, I'm joined by my third and final guest, Aoife O'Connor, another familiar face who's done many webinars and all kinds of health content for us in the past. Aoife's our in-house newspaper expert and is also largely responsible for all the brand new, exciting editions of newspapers you see added to the site on a weekly basis. And I believe I'm looking forward to this one. You're going to be telling us how you can use newspapers to find out more about military service.
I am indeed. Pitting myself against record sets, I'm going to be talking about newspapers. And to my mind, newspapers are the next big thing for any of your research because they are going to add the context.
Yes, details you just won't find anywhere else.
Indeed. So obviously, historically, newspapers have mainly concentrated on, the great men and the great battles. But if you really delve in, you can find the details of the ordinary men and women who served in military capacities and indeed on the home front from the early 1700s right the way through to the modern times. The newspapers that we have on the site range from the 1700s to the 2000s, so you'll be quite staggered by what you can find in there. So if we move to my first slide, So we're just going to have a little overview of the history of war in newspapers, and there are 27 million mentions of the word war in the newspapers. It's a little bit popular. Indeed, in newspaper history, war and newspapers go hand in hand.
I can imagine, actually, yeah.
And particularly when it comes to illustrations in newspapers and photography in newspapers. It's things like the Crimean War and the American Civil War in the 1860s, where you really begin to see photography come into newspapers. So we're going to have a look at what you can find. We're going to have a look at our specialist military titles, of which we have several.
I'm loving these images as well. These images are amazing.
Yes, and these are all coming from the newspapers, and I do have a little bias. I appreciate that most people have a bias towards photographs of their ancestors, but my bias is definitely towards the drawings. And so we'll have some search tips throughout then as well. If we move to the next.
Oh, back one.
Go. So as I said, our newspapers cover many of the conflicts that happened in the last 300 years. So you can start off with the War of Spanish Succession in the early 1700s and go right the way through to the Second World War and indeed beyond. So we know these wars by these names. But as they're happening, this is not what they're going to be called.
Of course, yeah.
You can't know that the 7 Years' War is the 7 Years' War.
Especially not if you're in year 2.
Yes, exactly. And also, wars tend to grow. They're like octopus, with tendrils almost, indeed. They sort of spread out and become other wars. So the 7 Years' War also had a component called the French and Indian War, or what we call the French and Indian War today. But the best way for you to narrow down your searches, because as I said, this is not how they're going to be known in historic sources, is to look at those dates. Go to internet sources, your history books, dare I say it, Wikipedia.
No, it is good for military history.
Those basics of, at least you'll know that the war happened in 1812. And so narrow your search down with the search function that's available on the website. So you can narrow down to a specific year, and then what I would suggest is beginning to search on other terms that will be coming up in the articles. So you're going to be looking at the combatants within the war. So you might look for something like French troops. We have to remember that newspapers are very much about us and them during a war.
Of course, propaganda heavy.
Propaganda heavy. It is about us and them, and so there's going to be an awful lot of articles about them.
Yes, I guess they need to sell the war to the general public, don't they?
They do indeed. Yeah. And it is that propaganda. There's a certain amount of not causing panic at home.
I can imagine.
So while there's integrity in reporting, in a way, your side is always winning until they lose. So you do have to kind of take what's written in the newspapers. It is somewhat surprising sometimes. Some of the newspapers can be quite hardline, and they will admit that things are happening that maybe the War Office wouldn't necessarily want them revealing.
And would that vary from title to titles? I guess it's just the position of their owner or whoever was running it.
You get that as you move later into history, and also the First World War, there wasn't as much strictures on the sorts of letters that men were sending home, and those letters then made their way into the papers.
Okay.
So you can have quite poignant letters.
If you found something like that, you'd be reading your ancestors' experiences in their own words, which is incredible, and you simply wouldn't find that anywhere else, would you?
No, absolutely. And I mean, young men, they don't always think to protect their mother
from
betrayal, so they send home these letters. But as I say, so a lot of these wars and these mutinies, rebellions, the modern names are not necessarily how they're going to be referred today. If we take the most obvious example, the First World War only became the First World War afterwards.
Of course, they need the second for it to be the first, I guess.
I believe it was called the First World War relatively soon after. It didn't wait until the second, but during it was sometimes the World War, because people did recognise that this was a very different conflagration than had happened before. But by the same token, you will just see it as the Great War or the World War or simply the war.
So Great War was a contemporary term then? Yeah. Okay.
It's all encompassing. I don't think any of us can conceive of living through 4 or 5 years of constant warfare. And my particular interest is in the home front in the Second World War. And if you think that rationing continued right into the 1950s...
Oh yeah, of course.
It's just that sort of level of deprivation and sort of that constant nervousness, and as we all famously know, at the declaration of the Second World War, Virginia Woolf committed suicide, saying she couldn't go through it again. So if we move on to the next slide. So what can we find in newspapers? Army and Navy promotions and movements to new stations and ports, details of equipment, which I have to say is kind of an interest of mine as well, vehicles and uniforms. The logistics of war just fascinate me, how you move food and men, and the way the post went from England to France to the front in a matter of a day, and that they were able to get a letter from home within 24 hours.
It's also something you don't think of.
No,
all the behind the scenes work that tends to get forgotten.
We would completely struggle today, I think. Battlefield images, which are hugely detailed, and indeed the first slide had a battlefield image that was a drawing from the Second World War of Canadian troops moving across the battlefield. Casualty lists, as we discussed earlier, casualty not always meaning that somebody died, but that they could be also missing, a prisoner of war, or injured. Rolls of honour, those tend to include the photographs. Those are the gentlemen who did pass, and they will have an entire page spread. Photographs in general, either the battlefield, of captured enemy soldiers, of their equipment, so you will also get information not just on the British troops, but also on the Commonwealth troops, who we've also already discussed, but also enemy.
And there is also a staggering amount of photographic portraits of because obviously most of the newspapers in the collection are local papers, so they write about local lads.
Absolutely, and that's the thing. That's where the local paper really comes into its own, because they will focus very heavily on telling that personal story of their local lads coming home. And I mean, with 827 newspapers as of today, it will change.
Counting,
it changes on a daily basis. If you're watching this in a few months' time, it'll be over 1,000 newspapers, and so on and so forth. We also, of course, have a lot of detail on the women's services and, as I say, my personal bias, the home front, rationing, what was happening for bombing and evacuation. And so there's a little food bulletin tip there from a newspaper. If we just move to the next slide, we'll just have a look at some of these. So we have a look at promotions and exchanges, and it just mentions by name the gentlemen who were being promoted or moved around, and the Royal Berkshire Regiment, 2nd Royal Berks Regiment, will leave Athlone on August 10th for Templemore. And I mean, it's so very precise.
No, it really is, isn't it?
It's not just they've gone or they're going. It is on August 10th. They will move from Athlone in the Midlands of Ireland, and they will go to Templemore. And then there's various people who have been replaced. It has to be said that in a lot of newspapers, there is a bias towards the officers.
I can imagine. Yeah, I mean, the class system was so prevalent back then.
So you will, and even when we get later to something else, you'll see that, enlisted men are listed separately to officers.
Okay.
When it comes to the casualty lists, unfortunately. So we just move to the next image.
Oh, wow.
And so these are some of the things you find. This is another portion on the top left, is another portion of that battlefield picture, and some incredible pictures of tanks, and I'm sure my husband would be able to tell me exactly what type of tank it is. And then we have the 9 women's services, and I just thought that was a lovely photograph.
That is lovely. I've never seen that before.
Dare name them off the top of my head just from looking at their uniforms, other than my own personal obsession, the Women's Land Army there at the end. Or perhaps it's the Timber Corps and I've got it entirely wrong. But yeah, no, the Timber Corps, the Women's Land Army, they're just such fabulous resources, and the work of women was equal to men at the time. They were moving aeroplanes, they were, dealing in hospitals, they were drivers, and it's one of those things that, on the one hand, we do want to make a big deal of it, but it was so normalised that they would take part. And these are services that were created during the course of the First World War and continued into the Second World War.
Okay, so a lot of the infrastructure was already there by the time the Second World War had come along. Okay.
Very much like rationing. Rationing, unfortunately, was a bit of a palaver during the First World War.
Yeah, I've heard that.
It wasn't introduced until very late. You had a lot of price rises and that sort of thing. By the Second World War, I mean, with that 1939 register, I just think it is the most amazing logistical feat that was ever done for a wartime.
No, it is. 60,000 numerators or something, wasn't it? Which is just incredible.
And just to be able to feed your nation throughout the war, which, as we know, a lot of the other nations, especially the landlocked nations, really suffered from the rationing issue. But there will be obviously a lot of complaints about rationing in the newspapers as well. So we have an image of a roll of honour there.
That is incredibly sharp. What paper is that from?
I don't recall, I'm afraid. I do have it in my notes, but unfortunately I don't have them with me here. And then one of my personal favourites, which I think was a favourite of, I'll say, all young boys during the war, was these silhouettes of domestic and enemy planes.
And I guess that's probably almost a bit of a public service announcement, is it? That's to help people identify what's flying over their houses.
Indeed. Yeah, absolutely. So they could look up into the sky and they would be able to recognise the plane as being friend or foe.
Or it drops bombs or it doesn't,
Exactly. Yes, indeed. And of course we all have our favourites. I put up the Hurricane, but of course I think I'm supposed to like the Spitfire. So if we could move on to the next slide. So we do also have a range of specialist military titles, and I'll just list them here and the coverage we have. I have to say that there are some gaps in this coverage, and we will work to complete those gaps. But by the same token, the range of material that you will get from the newspapers, the specialist military newspapers, is quite something. So if we have a look at each of these in turn, if we move to the next slide. So the volunteer service, the Naval and Military Gazette and the Army and Navy Gazette, the ones on the outside edges, left and right, are both for volunteer services. The volunteer service was formalised in 1859. It was a rifle service, and it was to encourage, well, I'm going to say men of a certain class.
Okay, so what, the kind of sporting gentleman type, is it?
Not quite, but certainly run by the sporting gentleman.
Okay.
So a little bit the way sort of one imagines the sort of Dad's Army kind of worked. You had a sort of a gentleman in charge, and then the slightly middle class grouping of men who would meet on a Tuesday night, and they would practice their rifle and their drill. And they paid dues, and they also had to pay for their own uniform. And this could range, and their own weapon. The army didn't want them using the long Enfield rifle because they felt it was too complex for them. But I think they list if they're using the long Enfield rifle in their little descriptions in the newspaper about themselves.
I just found it crazy to think that back then people could privately own military service weapons. And...
Oh, absolutely. Encouraged to purchase them. So in order to participate in this voluntary service, you really would have a disposable income that would allow you to spend anywhere from £8 to £12 on the accoutrements, the uniform, and they're rather proud of their uniforms. They list the facings that they're using. So you have essentially a grey uniform was said, but they would all dress it up with different facings. So the collars and the cuffs might be sort of black or scarlet or green. And so it wasn't a ragtag affair, but certainly the regular military, never thought very highly of it. It was intended as a force that would assist in, if the country was invaded. There was a fear in the 1850s that France would actually invade. And so this voluntary service was set up. Now, if you consider that, as I said, you had to have about £8 to £12 to participate in this, and then you had to pay dues, like a little subs fee every week or every month. And the average sort of factory worker in the late 1850s, early 1860s is maybe earning £1 a week. It's sort of 12 weeks' wages in order to just even participate in this. So generally speaking, the working classes and the rural communities were in the militia, which were trained by the military themselves, and they went off to a base for a number of weeks to train, and they would receive a certain little sort of pension or a top up to their money, and they could be called up at any time.
Okay.
The voluntary service were, as I say, much more middle class, and then they also were very interested in military things. So obviously newspaper guys saw a great thing, we can sell a new newspaper.
Yeah.
And so they sold this newspaper into that sort of middle class voluntary service. So if we move on to the next one. Also, the other thing that can create a newspaper is when the army moves into town.
Oh.
And a little bit like the Bennets, everybody gets very excited when the army moves into town. And the Aldershot Gazette was created when the army created an army base in Aldershot.
Oh, it's simply because such a large number of new men were moving in.
Population went from 800 to 13,000.
Whoa!
And Portsmouth obviously has always had a long association with the Navy.
Yeah.
But again, the population nearly doubled in the 1850s. And then finally, but we've touched on these before, we have the Illustrated War News, which was produced during the First World War, and the Weekly Casualty List. On the left, the Weekly Casualty List, very poignant publication, and this is the one that lists the enlisted men separately from the officers.
Okay.
And the Illustrated War News is not only useful for imagery of the entire army and indeed the Axis forces as well as, or not the Axis forces at that point, but the German forces and the British forces, but also all of the Commonwealth forces. So if you're interested in uniforms in particular, you'll get a lot of information in there.
Oh, wow.
So I think if we just move to the tips to end. And just the one thing I would say is that obviously if you're looking at the really early conflicts, we'll have quite delayed reporting.
Yes.
No telephones, no telegram, certainly no television, and there's no internet. So do broaden your search out for several weeks beyond that campaign.
Cool, yeah, that makes sense. I've seen letters printed in papers from soldiers who were actually dead at the time the letters were printed, but there was no reference to their death in the report, so I'm assuming the local paper and the families had no idea that young man had been killed.
It is quite possible, absolutely. Absolutely. But as I say, I think we'll just leave the search tips up and people can note those down, and we'll leave it at that.
Brilliant, thank you. I guess one final thing I'd like to add, we touched on it briefly, was that photographs, I know, finding a photograph is often a bit of a holy grail with this kind of research, and in many cases, newspapers are literally the only place you are going to find a photograph of servicemen. And they were printed with incredible frequency as well in local papers. So yeah, if you're keen to find a photo of your ancestor, do try the newspapers. But yeah, no, thank you so much for that, Eva. That was fantastic. So before we start our group panel, I drag everyone back up here with us. I'd like to introduce a short video that we've produced to share the stories of some very brave young men who gave their lives in service of their country. It's called In Memoriam, and the way we produced it was by using our fantastic collection of newspapers and finding in memoriam poems, which were touching poetic tributes left by grieving families to their relatives who were killed fighting. They're really powerful, and we're very pleased to be able to share this with you now. So yeah. Hello and welcome back. Thank you very much for watching the video. Thank you. We think it's very important to share these stories, and we feel very privileged that we're in a position to do so. So thanks again for watching, and thanks for joining us for this broadcast. But yeah, now time for the bit we've been looking forward to, which is answering your questions live. You've been sending quite a few in. You've been keeping the team busy, so thank you very much for that. But we've picked a selection. Obviously, we don't have time to answer them all live, but we've got a good few here. So first and foremost, I think this is a good starting question, actually. It's quite general, so anyone feel free to answer. And this is from Nancy Watkins, very nice and broad. Where do I start military research if I've never even tried it before?
Looking to me, aren't you? Well, first of all, talk to surviving family members. Look to see what exists in the family, I guess. You look at photographs, medals, documents. So get as much as you can from surviving members of the family. And then go to Findmypast and start looking at our huge collection of records. So you can search, if you know the sort of records you want, you can go to the A to Z search. So you type in service record British Army and you can see a lot of results. If you just want to focus in on military records, then do a search for the military records collection. It helps if you know the man's service number, if he was not an officer. Yeah. Officers didn't have numbers, but other ranks did. And just try different combinations. If you know the regiment, if it's, I posted this earlier on a blog of mine. If you're searching for Argyll and Sutherland Highlanders, for instance, don't type the whole blooming thing. Just type asterisk, which is the wildcard. ARG.
Wildcards, yes.
Wildcard searching. Always think of wildcard searching because you'll open up all the results.
And I guess, would you say it's useful if you are just starting out? it's better to start off broad and then narrow down as you're going along? Or I guess that depends on how much information you're starting with.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, I mean, I would generally go use the information I know. I would do the wildcard searching on a number if I knew the number. And if you're not getting results that you think you should be getting, then try different combinations.
Yeah.
So.
And also look at what guidance there is. I mean, I know on Findmypast,
of course,
you've got useful search tips and information about the records. And of course, since most, not all, I know most of your military records come from the National Archives, have a look on the National Archives site as well, because we've got guides about military records.
Yeah, they're very detailed as well, aren't they?
They might go into more.
And I think the ones on the National Archives website, they don't just cover what you hold as well, do they? They're quite broad and they cover all kinds of...
Yes, because nobody's got everything on everything.
Of course.
So we direct people, obviously, a lot to Findmypast anyway, but also elsewhere, places like the...
So if you're looking to get a World War II service record, which you need to, obviously they're not online yet, they're still held by the Ministry of Defence. There's a great section on the National Archives website that
tells you straight through.
It tells you every single thing you need to do. Yes, definitely check that out. And I'd also just like to echo what Paul said, which is get every scrap of available information from your relatives. Whether if it's First World War research, you might have a parent or a grandparent who remembered that person while they were alive and has a little bit of extra detail. And also, as Paul said, the work he did with veterans from the First World War, now is the time to do that with Second World War veterans. My grandfather sadly passed away 2 years ago, but I'm so pleased that it was my mum's idea a few months before he died. We sat him down in front of a video camera and just got him to tell his story and recorded it all, and it was amazing how much he was coming out with. When we had stuff he'd never told us before, but for some reason having a camera there, he really opened up, and we're so glad we did it because we've got it forever now. So yeah, if you can, I really would recommend doing that.
Can I just add to that, Alex? Not just Second World War either, of course. You've got Korean War,
Of
you've got
course,
Falklands War,
of course,
Falklands War.
yeah.
I remember the Falklands War, and I would have been old enough to serve in the Falklands War. But that's 30 odd years ago now, and there are people here, probably half the company, who weren't even born when the Falklands War was on, and it's those guys are in their 50s or 60s and above.
I work with a Falklands veteran that you.
I know him very well.
You know him.
Actually, that is really. I think the British Legion did a lovely campaign about it last year, Rethinking Remembrance, which was obviously Women's Remembrance Day. We do tend to associate it probably most closely with the First World War and then the Second, but it's still an ongoing thing. Wars are still being fought. There's still veterans out there who so. Remembrance isn't just a thing of the past, it's very, very present. So moving on, next question. This one I believe is it's another one for you, Paul, actually. I promise they weren't there, they're not all cool. But this one's from Sean Beattie, so thanks very much for sending this in, Sean. It was a good one, actually. I'd like to know about this. He said, is there any way of tracing nurses sent to France during World War I? Have you got any pro tips?
Nurses sent to France? We've got nurses' records on Findmypast. So again, you go to A to Z search and type nurse.
Yeah.
And I'll go to do that and find those records. British Red Cross Society as well.
I think we've got some Red Cross records as well, haven't we?
We do, but those records are free online as well with the BRCS. So you can look at the images. It's not full service records, but there are index cards which will say when somebody served overseas.
And I guess also newspapers as well, actually. If a local girl was serving, it's very likely they would have reported it. And I've seen photos of local nurses in the newspapers as well before. So
absolutely, I mean the Vera Britons would have been very well respected in the community and reported absolutely.
And women doing something in uniform was even bigger news than the men.
Oh, of course, yeah. Yeah, I remember actually when you see another lovely thing about newspapers is when you see the letters to the editors and the comments pages. So you can, it might sound cheesy, but I think one of the cool things about newspapers is that you can view these big historical events through a local lens. That does sound cheesy, but it is true.
Well, exactly.
And seeing these comments, I remember seeing one about the 1939 Register where someone was talking about the enumerators coming down, and his last comment was, and one of them was a woman. But you also get loads of newspaper reports about how the women were flocking into the pubs because the pubs were now pretty empty, and the men that were left behind weren't particularly pleased about this. And you find some very funny letters, kind of decrying their behaviour. But yeah, so I think we'll do another question. This one is I think this one's up for grabs with either you or you, Audrey. So actually, this is probably more of an Audrey question. Actually, this is very 1939 specific. So this is from Linda Elliott, who's asked, how frequently are the 1939 redacted records checked and released? Are they cross-referenced with the GRO Death Index?
Well, the GRO Death Index, that's definitely you guys. We don't touch that in the National Archives, but what we do is we get some records released individually. I mean, people I know who are Findmypast subscribers, they can send a death certificate.
Yes.
And then that will come through to us. But we also get people who are not subscribers, and they approach us direct for the record of a family member, and they send us the death certificate. We charge for the search, so if they're a Findmypast subscriber, it's much cheaper for them. Or if they've got a friend who's a Findmypast subscriber.
Even better.
But as for the regular redactions, you're better placed to answer that as to how often you do the updates.
Absolutely. So what we're doing is honouring the 100-year rule. So somebody must be 100 years old before we will open their record automatically. So we use the birth date information that's in the register, and so we programmatically, on average, it's sort of once a month. But if there's not a huge amount of records, we might let that slide to a 2-month period, and then we will open up a tranche of records based on the birth date of the people within the records.
Of course, because the birth dates are so
precise,
accurate, aren't they? Whereas with the geography, well, Audrey's gonna.
They're not necessarily, but they're the best we've got.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to say something else. I'm one of the people who does the actual paid searches if somebody wants a search done in the register. And while we're doing that, because I'm looking at the actual unredacted pages, if we happen to spot a mistake, a transcription error of any kind, then we can report that directly to Findmypast, which of course somebody looking at the open register wouldn't be able to do.
Yeah.
But sometimes we just happen to spot something in a closed record, and then we can report that as a transcription error. So we're working very hard on your behalf, public.
Thank you. And also, if you've used the register before, you've probably seen it. But there are very easy to use forms on the transcripts where you just at the bottom of the transcript, just click on it. It'll tell you every little bit of information you need to provide, and then that's basically you letting us know that this record and vice versa. If there's a record open that shouldn't be, it works both ways. So yeah, we're always grateful to people helping us grow the register. And yeah, watch this space. It's continuously growing.
Do we know how many records are being released each month, Eva, roughly?
It really does vary from month to month. After all, there are baby booms. But on average, it will be in the several thousands every month. And then, of course, we did do an exercise, but again, we had to be conservative about how we did this exercise because we didn't want to open records that we shouldn't, and we did indeed use the Giro indices to, as I said, conservatively open a larger tranche of records. And I think that was about a year ago that we did that exercise.
We announced quite a lot. I think it was something like 5 million new records over the course of a year.
Yes,
I think
indeed.
it was.
And then we opened all the vacant houses, because it can be confusing for people as to why a certain house isn't coming up that's perfectly occupied today.
Most of the ones I've ever lived in turned out to be vacant.
Oh really? And I love before in your bit the record you brought up was for your brother's house.
Yes.
And I just the 1939 register is amazing for house history as well. It's a great way of finding out who lived. Like when you're doing a bit of decorating, you find an old bit of wallpaper behind. You're like, who put this there? Use the 39 register, you might be able to find out. So I think this actually, to keep things timely, I think this might be our last question. So this is from Tom Pollard. Thank you very much for sending this in, Tom. Thank you to everybody who's been sending questions in. And Tom, I think this one's probably up for grabs actually. It's Paul, Audrey, anyone who fancies it. So Tom's asked, he has his ancestor's service number from World War II. I think we might have already answered this actually, but can find no trace on FMP. What percentage of World War II service records are available on FMP?
Zero.
I'm afraid. Yeah, we'd absolutely love them, but they are all held by the Ministry of Defence.
You have got the prisoner of war records.
We do, and we've got casualty lists. Yeah. There's British Army casualty lists and prisoner of war records. And I think, is it the prisoner of war records, is that because they were Foreign Office rather than War Office?
No, it's a difference between service record and other records. So the artillery records that Audrey was looking at were also Second World War, but they're not. It's not a service record. That was an enlistment book. These are POW records.
Yeah.
The service record is normally the attestation paper. So that's when the man attests for service and then he joins the regiment, and then it's his career throughout that, plus a whole plethora of papers generally shoved inside. So that's the service record. As Audrey says, you can find out information from TNA, but also just Google Veterans UK. Veterans UK. That will take you to the MOD site, and then on the main menu, if you scroll about a third of the way down on that list, it says how to obtain service records, and that's what you need to follow. I think it's about £30.
Yeah.
Okay, and do you know when will they be? It's a 100-year closing rule, isn't it? So we've got a bit of a weight in our hands, sadly.
Yeah, to be decided really on those.
And the logistics of dealing with that amount of paper is going to be phenomenal.
Yeah.
Oh, I can imagine actually.
Considering that about 2/3 First World War records
Of
are
course,
destroyed,
yeah.
it's going to be just a huge amount more. Because as far as we know, they've been weeded a bit, but there aren't any missing.
And also structurally, are they similar in format to the First World War records? Are they more detailed? Are they?
Well, they are. You see the same forms. You see the same
okay.
you see the same numbers on the army forms. It's the same type of forms, but there's just
Insertions.
a lot more. The thing is, with the early records, a hatchet job was done by the Luftwaffe and by the MOT.
Yeah.
But between them, they did a great job.
Yeah.
By weeding records or destroying records, so soldiers who were killed, those records were destroyed. You know, they're dead. They're never going to need they're never going to claim a pension. So soldiers before the First War, dead soldiers, all gone.
You don't need this stuff, yeah.
And then the Luftwaffe finished it off.
Is it am I right? I think it's 60% that were destroyed.
I think
Thereabouts.
Thereabouts.
Yeah,
Wow. Yeah,
but the Second World War records, they're still there, pretty much in their entirety.
There is one thing though, although we were talking about the armed forces, and yes, those records are still to the Ministry of Defence, but the people I mentioned before, the people in the Merchant Navy. Although Merchant Navy records are very difficult to deal with for all sorts of reasons, but there are some records for men who served and some women who served during the Second World War.
Okay.
There are some Merchant Navy records. I mean, there are some records that are on Findmypast, and we've also
I've got some Findmypast included.
yes. And there are some. We've got some records at the National Archives for some people, not for everybody, but they're indexed on the website. You have to request the records because a lot of these are for people who could still be living, so that you can't just make them public. But if you have got someone who was in the Merchant Navy in the Second World War, you may be able to get hold of a record because they're not at the Ministry of Defence. We might have something.
Okay.
It's only a might, but it's worth having a look.
So yeah, if you can do it, it's always worth a trip to the National Archives. If
It's
you're in the area, if you're there, I always love going. But yeah,
we love you visiting.
Thank you. I'll have to come again soon. But I think we should. I think it's a wrap. I think that was it. I think we've thoroughly enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as we have. I've certainly learned lots of new stuff. And yeah, have a fun. Oh, we're going to end with one more video. Actually, it actually feeds on nicely from what we were saying before about the British Legion's campaign last year, and that the remembrance is not something that's stuck firmly in the past. There are still there are many veterans from more recent wars that are still being fought. So I'd like to say another massive thank you to all our guests. Thanks so much for coming on. If you enjoyed it and you want to see more, this won't be the last you see of us. We'll definitely be on doing more webinars, more help content in the future, and we'll also be popping the panel's social media handles in the comments afterwards as well if you'd like to follow them and keep up and get more expert tips. So yeah, massive thanks again, and enjoy our final. Well, not enjoy is the wrong word. Watch our final video, which is what's it? I've forgotten the name. Final video on basically rethinking remembrance with some very personal stories from veterans of more recent wars.
Remembrance for me is every day. It became a lot more personal when a friend of mine, a year older, joined the Royal Navy, and then the Falklands flashed up.
We used to have our instructors come and talk to us and tell us stories, and one point I remember really hit home was when we were getting told a story by our instructor. He almost lost his life because he stepped on an IED, and for that to happen to him and for him to still be here, you realise that there's quite a big selfless commitment.
For me it's more about the loss of a friend, I think, and I just take time that week to think about it, keep a picture of him. That's about it.
Sadly, in the conflict, Stephen Ford was killed, and then of course it's no longer just names on graves, it's actual people we know ourselves.
To have a bit of time where you can just dedicate it to remembering people and people that were close to you, or even just people that made basically the ultimate sacrifice.
I'm quite proud, not necessarily the decision to join, but of the things I did when I was there and the people that I worked with. Quite remarkable individuals.
remembrance for me is every day. It became a lot more personal when a friend of mine, a year older, joined the Royal Navy, and then the Falklands flashed up.
We used to have our instructors come and talk to us and tell us stories, and one point I remember really hit home was when we were getting told a story by our instructor. He almost lost his life because he stepped on an IED, and for that to happen to him and for him to still be here, you realise that there's quite a big selfless commitment.
For me it's more about the loss of a friend, I think, and I just take time that week to think about it, keep a picture of him. That's about it.
Sadly, in the conflict, Stephen Ford was killed, and then of course it's no longer just names on graves, it's actual people we know ourselves.
To have a bit of time where you can just dedicate it to remembering people and people that were close to you, or even just people that made basically the ultimate sacrifice.
I'm quite proud, not necessarily the decision to join, but of the things I did when I was there and the people that I worked with. Quite remarkable individuals.